Right. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you today to our third in the series of our Chambers Trade Academy sessions. My name is Susana Cordova. I'm the head of international trade at the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce. And today we will be speaking and focusing on export controls regulations and why they exist. We have as our guest speakers, Jeff Gunn from Ceteros Consultant, one of our long-standing approved suppliers. So I'm gonna first going to give you a very quick introduction to what the Chambers Trade Academy session is, and we will have a few chances for Q&A later on after Jeff have done his presentation. So what is the Chambers Trade Academy? It's actually a joint initiative from selected chambers of commerce, as you have seen in the first slide, where we are providing traders with virtual free sessions to members and non-members, covering all the bases about exporting, importing, latest regulations updates, how to grow their business overseas, diversify your supply chain. Combined, we represent more than 15,000 businesses across all sizes and sectors, but we actually engage with more than 70,000 on an annual basis. We are international trade practitioners who work daily with exporters and importers, supporting you in every stage of your internationalization phase and with the complexities of trading overseas. The kind of support that we provide combined across all the chambers that are participating on this initiative includes international trade events where we raise awareness about different opportunities overseas, export, import, and customs training courses, bespoke advice and consultancy packages, readiness assessment, helping you identify the right market for your international strategy, market research and entry services, partner finding, commercial debt recovery, foreign exchange services, letters of credit, credit checks. We are also providers of certification, legalization, and apostille services, meaning we help exporters and importers with documents such as certificates of origin, import certificates, ATA carnets for temporary exports, and much more. We are also customs brokers, so we help UK legally registered traders with their customs entries for export and imports. We are here to provide you with information and guidance about going global. So now I want to welcome Jeff from Ceteros Consultant, who will be going into more detail about what are export controls, why they exist, and why they are important, and how to manage those. So I'm going to start sharing my slides, and Jeff, if you may share yours, that will be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. I'll just share my screen. So, thanks, Susanna, and welcome everyone. This morning we're going to have a brief run through export controls, so how the export of controlled items works in the UK and generally around the world as well, in other countries as well. See how that works, and a brief discussion about how we know if an item is controlled or not. So it's a very high level strategic discussion that we'll have this morning, and there'll be time for questions at the end. If you have any questions of a specific nature, I won't be able to get into too many direct specific questions against your own business, but general questions I'd be happy to answer. So strategic arms control regulations. There are legal means by governments to control the export of certain goods, like I mentioned, and those goods are clearly defined and they're enshrined and embodied in international treaties, foreign policies of a nation, or for the defence and security objectives of that particular nation. And this morning we're going to be discussing primarily the UK jurisdiction, so it's UK foreign policy, defence and security objectives and the UK meeting international treaties is why we have UK arms control regulations. They can be directly defined by national government, and we'll look at a few of them for parliamentary legislation, or through international organizations and treaties. Some of these examples of the international treaties, groups and protocols, and you'll get an idea of what we're talking about when we start looking at these treaties, because they're fairly self-explanatory. The Chemical Weapons Convention. So the Chemical Weapons Convention, international treaty based on the prohibition of chemical weapons around the world, and we are signatories to that in the UK, and therefore part of the mechanisms we use to comply with that Chemical Weapons Convention is not to export items, instruments, or technology relating to chemical weapons. Missile technology and missile components, again, we're part of the Missile Technology Control Regime, which again controls missiles and delivery means, mechanisms around the world. So we, again, sign up to that, and you'll see that a lot of the technologies and goods, products are relating to missiles are controlled also. Nuclear Suppliers Group. This covers the technologies to enable nuclear proliferation, and also in the civilian nuclear side as well. So you'll get sort of a lot of the civilian nuclear power station type technologies and capabilities are controlled as well. And they're all defined through the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And the Wassenaar Agreement. The Wassenaar Agreement, that was not quite as self-explanatory. That primarily deals with your conventional military goods and products, so your military equipment, and they're all defined what does make a piece of military equipment and what is controlled within the military equipment, and that's all agreed through the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is an international agreement that's signed off, and it does get amended, and we then filter that through to our own national legislation. So that's where most of the decisions are based on what is controlled. We also have human rights conventions, etc. as well, which we'll talk about later on. So the purpose of these controls, why do we have trade controls in the first place? It's to give some kind of control to the government on what private business is actually exporting out of the country. And it's to make sure that the government's committee is following its commitments on a national level to non-proliferation and arms control. The regulatory framework that we use ensures that UK science and technology is not, says there, intentionally or unwittingly used for the purpose of WMD, weapons of mass destruction, WMD, by other states or non-state groups, i.e. terrorism. And so it's intentionally or unwittingly. So it's up to all individuals that are exporting is to understand the product and where it fits into the UK arms control regulations, because we don't want to be adding to or breaching non-proliferation arrangements or arms control arrangements around the world. That's what you'll be prosecuted by, and that's the UK's control of that to make sure that they have a handle on it. Specifically, they're there to protect UK national and allied security. We don't obviously want to be selling our secrets to everyone. We need to control that, and we need to understand who's getting what, where, and when. From a national security side, there's certain weapon systems, perhaps, or capabilities, technologies even, that we don't want falling into the wrong hands. So the government has to control that export from private by licensing. So you have to apply for a license if your item is controlled. Support non-proliferation. So this is the UK doing its part for non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and conventional weapons around the world, to make sure that we don't start arms wars, escalation in conflicts, etc., and maintain regional stability. So we don't want to arm up a country out of battle and destabilize a certain region of its neighbours through progressive arms sales process. So we have to control that. And this is what the licensing system does. When you get a license, it goes through a number of organisations within the government, offices within the government, and they look at if you're going to be doing any of the aforementioned. Also prevent internal repression, human rights. We'll have a look at the human rights list a wee bit later as well. And also internal repression can actually lead over into the other lists, the military lists, for instance. There's certain weapons, certain systems that might be totally appropriate to sell for the defence of a nation. So every nation has its right to self-defence and its defence forces. However, there's certain weapons that wouldn't be appropriate perhaps for ministries of interior, police forces, etc., where they're policing their own internal citizens. And so therefore, certain weapon systems, you might get a license for sale to defence forces, but you wouldn't get one to a Ministry of Interior, for instance. So end use is very important as well when we're actually talking about arms control and arms control licensing. So you need to know what the customer is going to be using it for and on whom and whom purposes of it. And support foreign policy. And we see that with sanctions and embargoes. And that's flavour of the month at the moment. We see a lot of sanctions being put out against organisations and individuals in Russia, for example. And that is where then the support of foreign policy comes in. We also see that obviously countries subject, or individuals, organisations subject to embargoes and sanctions can actually, or do, try to work their way around those sanctions. So you have to be particularly careful if you're exporting sanctioned items, that they're not finding their way to the locations, individuals or organisations which are sanctioned. So that's the foreign policy aspect of it. And comply with international treaties and protocols, which the previous slide highlighted. So it's actually technically illegal to start shipping stuff without the appropriate due diligence on the international treaty side of it, protocols for arms conventions, CWC, etc. How do you know if your goods are actually listed as controlled? Well, there's a number of lists available or used by the UK government and published by the UK government, and they're all brought together in the UK strategic controlled lists. And it's a consolidated list of goods, of items that require export authorization from Great Britain or Northern Ireland. So you would look in the lists, and that would then define if your product or goods or technology is controlled or not. I'd just like to highlight now, just to define technology. Technology is generally defined as things like drawings, plans, capability to manufacture the product. So it could be intangible, i.e. it could be sent in an email through the mail, across the internet, or downloaded from a server. It could even take the form of a telephone call, because it could be information. So that's the technology aspect of it. So it's not just the physical good that's controlled, it's also the technology, the intangibles connected to that product as well that are controlled in many cases. So let's have a look at what we mean by military goods then. Goods which are specifically designed or modified for military use. You see this obviously often abbreviated as DMMU, designed or modified for military use. It doesn't mean to say that all military goods are controlled, and it's not just weapons that are controlled. This list defines clearly what in the military environment is controlled and what is not controlled. And just because it's used by the military, again, doesn't mean to say it's controlled. You know, a dustbin could be used by the military, it's certainly not controlled. So once you've checked if your goods are on the list for military products, then it would be listed, and then you'd get a code for it. And if it's not on the list, you define it as not listed, and it's not under military list control. So that's just to clarify that point. This doesn't mean that everything that the military uses is controlled. But again, and it's not just weapon systems, it could be other items associated with equipment. And that's all defined within the UKML, as it's often referred to, the UK military list. Here's an example of a list entry, just to get you an example of how they're codified. So if something's codified ML19B, you see it's a direct energy weapon system related to countermeasures equipment or test models as follows, and specifically designed components therefore. And B would be particle beam systems capable of destroying or destruction or affecting mission abort of a target. So that's a particle beam weapon is controlled, and it would be code ML19B. So that's the way it builds up. So you've got, that's quite a high-tech thing. I mean, you're talking Star Wars sort of lightsabers sort of things. They are laser systems for either direct destruction of a target or to cause permanent or temporary blindness. They would become under that class. You notice also that sometimes the defense against these weapons is also controlled. So if you look at ML19, so equipment specifically designed or detection or identification of or defense against systems in 19A or 19C. So yeah, so if you've got equipment designed to either detect, defend, or identify maybe the radio frequencies, etc., they would, in 19C, they would also be controlled equipment and technology as well. Okay, so that's a typical example of a codification. I'd just like to highlight here when I'm talking about codification, these are codifications from the controlled strategic, the strategic arms control lists. They're not commodity codes. That is a mistake that's often made. People start talking about commodity codes. The arms control codification is something completely different, and it's taken from a different list, and that's a strategic arms control list. Dual use goods. So many other goods are also controlled in the UK, and these are available to buy commercially, typical off the shelf, but they're the high-end product, very much enhanced capabilities, and they may be useful or used in chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear warfare type equipment or weapons, or used in conventional weapons development, manufacture, etc., etc. So they're also controlled. That's dual use list, and that makes up a high proportion of the goods that are actually controlled. They're divided into different categories, and it's self-explanatory. You see there 0 through 9. So you've got examples there of nuclear materials and equipment, category 0. So that's primarily, we're talking about the civil nuclear industry there. A lot of their kit is category 0 materials, and they would be codified as such. And then you've got all the way through an example of a list entry, and you'll see what I mean about the equipment's used to create the controlled items. So dimension inspection or measuring equipment, equipment positional feedback units, and electronic assemblies as follows. So that covers a wide spectrum of general industrial machinery. However, if you look at the specifics of it, they get very detailed on its capability and its performance. And as you see, if you've got a computer controlled or coordinate measuring machine, a CMM, then you've got actually then the details. You can go and say, does our machine or is the machine that we're manufacturing to sell within these specifications? If it is, then it's controlled under dual list. If it's not, if it falls outside that, then it's not listed and therefore not controlled. And that's a good example of dual use items. They're very much defined on the specification of the equipment as opposed to the destinations, etc. You still need a license and we would still look at that, but it's all to do with the specifications of the item. And when you get into the high specification equipment, that's where you're talking for manufacture of WMD. And they go through all that, chemicals are in there as well, etc., etc. So PL entries. Earlier on I mentioned about the UK government deciding to have its own controls or restrictions on items that are not come from international protocols. So these could be items that the UK decides are controlled and they're unique to the UK. That control is unique to the UK against specific territories. An example of that, for instance, is the sale of aircraft parts and equipment and technology going to Iran. So if you are producing any of these parts or components for, then they should not be finding their way into Iran under this PL 9009. And this is an area that's often overlooked. And if you are controlling this, even if you're selling it into the UK, you should be putting on your commercial documentation. This item is covered by PL 9009. It's prohibited export or any destination in Iran. And then everybody knows that they cannot be sending these items to Iran, especially if they're outside the country. Because if you were sending them, say, to France, sending any of these parts to France and they were finding their way to Iran, you're still in breach of the PL 9009. And, so you have to, one, speak to your customer when you're doing the initial sales, and then you put it on your dispatch paperwork or your commercial paperwork, highlighting the fact that it's got a destination control on it. And that sometimes we refer to as destination control statements, where you say, no, you can't be sending this here under UK, for UK law purposes. And it's up to you to make sure that other people don't send them on as well once they go outside the country. So that's good understanding and due diligence of your customers, what they're using them for. Human rights list, I mentioned this earlier on. So we obviously don't want to be exporting capital punishment products used for the manufacture of capital punishment equipments, torture goods, etc., etc. And this is all tied up in various international laws on human rights, UN, European charters, etc., declarations and resolutions. And an example of that would be, a fairly straightforward example, battens and truncheons and shields with metal spikes in them. It's all very medieval. If you read the human rights list, it's quite sort of medieval in its definitions of articles, but these things happen. Cat o' nine tails, good old naval tradition there. But again, nowadays it's verboten, so we can't be exporting cat o' nine tails and whips with lashes and thongs, whips with barbs, hooks, and spikes. It does become quite medieval in its definitions of things. But these things do get sold around the world. People do use them in certain areas, and we don't want to be any part of that by encouraging it. So we make sure that we don't breach our regulations by selling these. So difficult to imagine any UK manufacturer manufacturing this, but it's there, and you don't want to be caught up in that. End use controls. Now this is basically a catch-all control. So it basically says the UK government if you suspect goods, software technology is intended for military use or purposes related to WMD, then it may come under a catch-all. So you've got to refer to the Export Control Joint Unit for advice and for information, and then they would refer with other government agencies to advise you on that. So again, you're the manufacturer, you understand what it's doing. Is it being used for bona fide purposes? And you'd find that out on your due diligence. If you get any queries, you would then be referred to ECGU. Or if you're aware of government concerns, so if you know that the government is sanctioning certain area and you think your goods might be breaching that sanction, or if you're unsure, then seek advice, and you make sure you're kept up to date. You should be, if you're exporting, especially if you're exporting control goods, you should be getting notice to exporters from ECGU, which keep you up to date with sanctions, with what's been going on. But they also publish on a 3-monthly cycle a list of prosecutions as well, who's been prosecuted for what and what the fines are. So that always makes interesting reading. So if you're aware of any government concerns, you may need a license, or if you've been informed that you need to get an export license after getting advice from ECGU. So obviously, if they get in touch with you and they don't like your product or have got information about a contract you have, you may need to get a license. And again, it's always in the government's prerogative to not give you a license, and therefore you've got issues. And I've seen that happen before, where companies basically get their goods impounded, and get stuck in the system, and it turns out that their products are not being used for what they probably thought they were going to be used for, and therefore all deals are off. And that is a situation you do not want to get involved in, because it can cost you a lot of money as an exporter and as a manufacturer, because it may well be that you can't perform to deliver a contract that you'd previously made. So you could be lose a lot of money, especially if the items have already been manufactured. So again, due diligence, and know what you're manufacturing, know what the risks are involved with it, and seek advice and support where appropriate. So how does the management and enforcement of all these regulations actually work? So when you apply for a license, if you find that your products are licensable, you would do that through a system online called Spire. That's soon to switch over to Light, a new system's coming in, along with the other government export computer systems. You may also see the HMRC are updating their systems. Spire is the system used for export of controlled goods and licensing. And that's the Export Control Joint Unit that administers that, and they administer the applications and issue of license as well, and the audit of licenses. So think of them like DVLA and driving licenses. They do all things for the administration of it. If you get any issues, contact ECGU and they issue the licenses. There's lots of different types of licenses available. I'm not going to go into that now, but you've got to administer all your licenses as well through Spire, and that's where you control your license management, or Light and moving forward. Once you put your application in, this is where you'll see the scope and the depth of the actual license application process and administering it. So ECGU will get the license application. They will do a technical assessment on your license. This is where it gets quite important, because people often get concerned that it takes a long time to get a license, or that there's an issue getting a license. So first off, ECGU will do a technical assessment of your application. And in that, they'll primarily ask themselves, do they understand what you're applying for the license for? Do they understand that what you're exporting? If the answer to that is yes, do they understand where you want to send it, and the ultimate end user. If that's all clear, do you have the appropriate documentation from the end user undertakings, etc., signing off that they're going to use it for a specific reason or whatever, and that's all in the end user undertaking, and it conforms to your purchase order from them as well. So once that all tallies up and all the technical aspects of the application have been ticked off, it then goes around a virtual board. So it's the different government agencies, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, the Development Office for Overseas Trade, other government departments. What I'm maintained by them is security type departments, MI5, MI6, etc., and they will sign off on it saying, yeah, all good to go, no problem with that. And the Foreign Office is very important on that. And it's policed, the whole system is then policed. Once the license is issued, that license is policed when it's used by HMRC. So as it moves across the UK border, customs boundary, HMRC check it, make sure it's there, make sure it's appropriate, make sure all the details are correct against the shipping documents. And if they're not, then they'll come back to you. If there's any issues about exports not being legal and fully compliant, then it's HMRC that would then prosecute, and that prosecution would be upheld through the Crown Prosecution Service. So that's basically the way it works. If you get a fulfill of an ECGU visit, because if you're using open licenses, then you will get a visit. They say a visit, it's an audit by ECGU. They'll come along and look at your processes, your what you've been doing on exports, and making sure you're managing them appropriately inside your business. And if they're not happy, it could well be that they ask you to send a declaration, a self-declaration to HMRC and themselves to basically fess up to your infringements. If they're really bad, or if they've stopped your goods going out and it's pretty blatant that it's an intentional breach, then it will be HMRC that's knocking on your door and issuing and taking it forward from there to hand over to the Crown Prosecution Service if appropriate. So that basically covers, in a nutshell, UK strategic arms control. Has anyone got any questions specifically about the higher level strategy on export control in the UK with rate to control goods?
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really good and very comprehensive. Can I ask you to stop sharing the slides so I can put ours? If there are any questions, please, this is the moment where we can pose those questions in the Q&A. If not, I have one, Jeff.
Yeah.
You were talking about, technologies being subject to export controls,
Yeah.
licenses. And you also, in one of the slides, I saw the software. But what about things like training, which is with the purpose of, military training, or consultancy, which it can be quite wide in that? Are those services within that scope?
Not in a civilian sense per se. It depends what you're using as a training reference and the training reference documents you're using. If it's highly confidential. Obviously, if you're training classified material overseas, your chances are you're signed up to the Official Secrets Act, and therefore you'll be breaching that. So if they don't get you one way, they get you another. So generally speaking, training devices can be controlled depending on their nature, and they would be within the lists. And so I have seen it. And it is an issue that is clearly defined in the lists if the training products are defined as well. So it could be for weapons especially, it could be like space models for the you know, when you're designing garments of a pistol, etc., then they might well be controlled. Training devices, simulation devices at a tactical level can be controlled as well. So that's covered by it. But generally speaking, training in a consultancy is not specifically controlled unless you're getting into the real tactical end of it or a highly classified area, in which case, yeah, be warned. You should know better if you're consulting.
Okay, thank you. And the other thing that you mentioned is dual use, and some of those, you know, that are commercially available to people just to buy. And my question was more about, I mean, we've seen an increase on, you know, maybe categorized initially as toys, which could be used potentially for, will those be immediately on the list, or there is like a fine line where they can just be passed as toys instead of
the dual use list? No, the dual use list is very specific in its definition and scope of the product. So, you know, things that are, you know, decommissioned weapons are covered in the military list. If they're not lethal, if they're non-lethal, look-alike plastic toys, and they're not controlled per se. It depends on what you're using them for and what the purpose is, what they're designed for. They're designed as toys, etc., etc. But yeah, you'd also have to be very careful as well when you're carrying something like that in your hand luggage. That's another point I should mention in hand luggage. A lot of the dual-use goods as well. It can be very tempting for people to carry sales samples in their hand luggage, especially on very small things. If your goods are controlled, do not fall into the trap of shoving them in your hand luggage, especially things like computer boards, chips, etc., etc. So just be very careful of that, and certain items of clothing as well. Simply because also the going through the customs with controlled items in your person is very difficult as well. It's an arduous trip to go down, and it's a lot easier just to pack them up, get them licensed, and send them out, and then meet up with them at the other end, where they've all been appropriately licensed on a temporary export license or whatever. So don't fall into that trap, and be very careful with that. And don't, you know, salesmen can be particularly blasé, sticking stuff in the bottom of their suitcase. It's not worth the issue.
And in terms of once you understand that you do need a license, how long you will say what's the range of time normally that will it take to apply and get it approved?
In general terms, right? So let's have a very, very brief discussion about two of the most common types of license: the open license. The open general export license is there's over 40 of them. If you can use an open license, you use it, and you don't actually have to apply to each time you use it. You register to use it on Spire prior to the first time you use it, and you get that approval within 24 hours generally to actually, once you've registered to use it, and then you can use that open general export license whenever you want without further ado, so to speak. You don't have to apply to use it each and every time. So general open licenses or open general licenses are the best ones to use if you can use it. The downside on that is you have to keep a record of all your exports, all the documentation, and every time you do use it, because that is what the ECGU will come and audit, and you will be open for audit if you register to use an OGEL. So you're opening the door to ECGU, which is a good thing. The second thing is on a sale, you've got to make sure it's a single individual export license. You've got to make sure you've got all your ducks in a row before you get your application in. And 9 times out of 10, delays are caused by internal process delays, not having their end user documentation in line, not having the correct purchase orders, the addresses on purchase orders, etc., because that can all lead to delay. You need to get in a good quality application Make sure there's no technical concerns from the ECGU. So you want to keep it relatively simple, but quite detailed. It's a difference, sort of a contradiction there. It's got to be detailed enough, but not too detailed. It's going to cause confusion. Don't be ambiguous. Get a good, clear application in. Then it makes life easy for the technical assessment to be conducted, and then for the go around the boards around other government departments, and that could take up to 6 weeks from application. But you've got to make sure you get a good application in. And if you don't get a good application in because you rush it, then that can take longer, and it's your own fault, really.
Of course. And has there been instances, I mean, from what I can gather is, yes, you apply online, you submit information, but are there any instances where the ECU will prefer to go to your premises, or you know, have like a physical inspection of the product or anything like that in order to grant you the export license?
Well, I mean, you mean customers viewing product on your premises?
Yeah. So they apply for something, they submitted the paperwork, but you know, for X, Y, Z reason, they said, well, actually, we want to come and see the product. And
there's no problem. And this is right. This is where security, national security, and the Official Secrets Act, etc., comes into it, versus arms control, trade controls. The trade controls cover the export of the goods and technologies. They're not primarily there, even though we do say we're concerned about the security. They're not primarily there to enforce the Official Secrets Act per se. Now, I've not mentioned it here, but the Form 680 deals with export of classified materials, or letting other people see your classified materials if they are classified, and you would have restrictions placed on that anyway by the government and probably the Ministry of Defence about who can and can't see it outside export control. But yeah, there's Form 680 is basically a release from the Ministry of Defence to allow you to export classified material, UK classified material. That is over and above the license. It's separate to the license. Just because you've got the Form 680 from the MOD, it's not an export license. And likewise, having the export license does not mean that you can export it if it's classified. You need also the MOD approval. So they're slightly different on that. The American side of it is more tied up, but that brings its own problems with the ITAR regulations, which we're not going into today. But yeah, so they're separate but related on classified material and the movement of.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 questions from the audience, so I'm just gonna read them. If you cannot find your goods on the goods checker, how can you check if a license is needed?
Well, here's the gotcha. If they're not on the goods checker, right? So I assume they're using the online goods checker to try and find their item. Well, that is a blunt instrument. Your ultimate list is the Strategic Arms Control List. If it's not on there, it's classified as not listed and therefore does not require a license. That's NLR, no license required. So yeah, the goods checker is a fairly rough instrument. So just be careful of that. But get into the street. It's a 310-page document. The dual use list ones are the most difficult to establish if it's listed or not. But generally speaking, you can tell if you're, and if you get any doubts, and you can say it, you can also go to ECGU, or a consultant, export control consultant, and they can come in and I can do determination. But sometimes there's a lot of discussion to whether something is covered by the detail. But that's, by the time you get down to that level, you know what, you're probably applying for other licenses anyway, depending on your industry. So yeah.
Thank you. I got another. Recent fines for breach of these registrations running into the hundreds of thousands of pounds have been published, by the identity of the firms concerned has not, because it is not, according to HMRC, in the public interest. For the lesser amounts, the identity has been given. What is your opinion about this?
Okay then, right. Right. So that's interesting. So the reason they're maybe not been published is because the fines that you read in the notice to exporters, they've not been prosecuted. The majority of the fines, that they're not fines. If you read it, they're actually payments, and they're actually been out of court settlements that have been made. So instead of HMRC saying, look, this is really boring, you've breached the regulations, give us £100,000, and some of them do stretch into not just tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, give us £250,000, and we'll call it quits. And it's an out of court settlement, and that's why you'll probably find that the identities have not been published. If it goes through the courts, and generally speaking, the out of court settlement, you can take that number and double it, and that's why people pay the out of court settlement. Then they will. Then you've got, they'll be go through the courts, and it'll be name all, see all, tell all, unless it's governed by official secrets, of course.
Okay, got another one. You mentioned 6 weeks from date of application to grant of license. Is this typical and expected, or has it worsened in recent months? Are civil servants increasingly perceived as working to rule?
Right, interesting question. The fact is, you've identified 2, or maybe 3 points there. First, the 6 weeks is a aspirational date. It's a KPI for them. And generally speaking, they do stand up quite well to that, depending on your product and your location. Sometimes civil servants working to rule. Okay, firstly, they are civil servants. Got to understand that. And I'm not demeaning or bad-mouthing civil servants, but the fact is they will do what it takes to do. Also, they're under a lot of pressure, or they sometimes can become under a lot of pressure, and they'll just brush it off from politics. So I've seen people trying to go through the political chains, and of course, by the time it comes up to the minister and then all the way back down again, by the time it gets to the civil servant sitting on the desk, there's a human nature aspect that drives in that. Generally speaking, what I've seen where there's been delays, it's been a year and a half, 2 years ago now, was the government was taken to court, the High Court, over the granting of licenses to countries involved in the Yemen, and there was effectively a moratorium placed on the issuing of licenses to the Arab coalition that was involved in the conflict in Yemen, and that caused a real backlog. So they weren't actually, yes, they were working to rule because they were under getting prosecuted at that time in the High Court, the government was. But I don't see sort of any malicious actions, and I'm not aware of any delays at the moment. But you can get into, sometimes you get delays where they come back and they'll ask questions for clarification on technical. And but you've also always got a technical, your case officer, who should be able to answer any questions if there's a specific delay on a specific license, and they should be able to give you an update and guidance onto why the delay is, and then you get a better understanding, or you can assist them in clearing out that blockage.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff. I don't see any more questions on it. So before we go, thank you so much, Jeff, for sharing all this. I think it was very comprehensive. And if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to your local chamber, and we will make sure that somebody can give you some support on that. So before we close up, if I can ask you to please quickly to answer a quick poll that we've got, and especially we're interested to know what kind of topics you would like us to cover in the future for the next set of the Chambers Trade Academy session. So if I can ask you to just quickly answer the poll that is showing on your screen, I will be deeply grateful. Thank you. And Jeff, just the last one is there any final top tips that you would like to give to exporters about how to go on about, you know, applying for an export license? Just things
Yeah, I
that
mean,
you think...
the understanding of export licenses and how to make an application, I think, is vitally important, along with determination of goods. How do you determine your goods, and as a company? How do you record that? How do you change it if you've decided that it's changing? How do you update it? I think having an integrated business process is key to your export control. Often it's just left to one person sitting in a vacuum almost in the company. But in fact, export compliance takes place across a company, so it should be integrated across your whole business management system or quality management system. If you're ISO 9001, for instance.
Thank you so much. Well, I think that's it from us today, and stay tuned, register with your local chamber. We will be putting more sessions in the autumn period. So if you have any other things that you want to talk to us, and as I said, just contact your local chamber. And as we mentioned earlier at the start, the slides and the recording will be sent out as a follow-up by individual chambers. So thank you for joining us today, and wishing you a great week. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.
Right, we'll yeah, close. Thank you, Jeff, and then anything else, we'll just keep in touch. Brilliant, thank you, bye.